personal dependency. I always have fun with this, sorry. Personal exemptions are you and your spouse. Now, what you were referring to, and I don't know everyone by name, you guys should have filled out those 10 cards for me. Usually at the Loop, because I see those students so frequently, I know them, half of them already, but I don't know anyone here, and I want to get to know your names. But that was actually because you can also have dependency exemptions. Personal exemption amounts we're dealing with here for 2014, I believe, is $39.50. Now, what if you know that your husband or wife, as the case may be, loves wild mushrooms? You do not eat mushrooms. So you went out picking wild mushrooms, you cleaned them, sauteed them in a frying pan, fed them to your spouse, and your spouse then dies of irreversible liver damage because they were toadstools. What is your filing status for the year of your spouse's death?
Still do it joint.
Married filing joint. How many personal exemptions do you get in that year? Personal, 2. You get your dead spouse in the year of death. Interesting, because normally your marital status is determined on the last day of the taxable year. Your spouse dies in May, your spouse is dead, and you're a single lady or man at the end of the year, but it's for that year of death that you get the filing joint and the personal exemption for the dead spouse. Now let's talk about the kids. That's over here on this whiteboard. A qualifying child, first of all, there's relaxed requirements for citizenship. So that won't be a big issue. Except for disabled kids that are less than 19 years old or 24 if a full-time student. No gross income test. Oh, but what's this? Child cannot have provided more than half of their own support. Let's talk about that. Let's say your child is a sophomore at U of I Champaign and works for one of the campus offices and makes $10,000 a year. She puts that into a bank account, and you are paying all of her tuition and living expenses. Can you claim her as a dependent? Yes. But let's say she makes $10,000 a year working at the campus office at U of I, and she uses that to pay 60% of her own support. Can you claim her as a dependent? No. Who claims her? Claims herself.
I thought if you made $10,000 a year, you have to file a return, your own return.
She has to file a return, that's right. But I'm just saying you can't claim her as a dependent because...
But if she's going to file her own return, she can't be claimed as a dependent on another return.
That's right, because, and that's true over here too for qualifying relative. But remember, that's a good point. That's another reason why she could not be claimed as a dependent. On the exam, there'll be a problem where a person will be paying 60% of their own expenses at college. So for 2 reasons, the one you mentioned and the other one, that person would not qualify as our dependent. So we're in agreement on 2 grounds. One you raised that I hadn't thought of, and one I raised. So you'll be good on the exam. Watch out, the greater the dollar amount might determine whether or not this is met. They must have their principal place of abode with the taxpayer for greater than half of the tax year, but obviously temporary absences for education or the military will not disqualify you. Well, that seemed pretty straightforward, but what about this qualifying relative? I had a student once back in the 80s. The student said, Bill, my father is a UK citizen and he's living in London, England, and I'm paying almost all of his support. Can I claim him as a dependent on my US income tax return? And what's the answer? No. Because remember, the person claimed as a dependent, if they're qualifying relative, has to be a citizen or resident of U.S., Canada, or Mexico. What's unique about Canada and Mexico? They're next door, that's right. I always smile at that. They did a test of LA high school kids, and 75% of the LA kids couldn't find Chicago on the map, but I can understand that, they're all surfing and stuff. You know. But the thing that was scary was 20% of the students couldn't find LA on the map, and that's where they lived. But you're right, US, Canada, Mexico. Legal or blood relation except what Bill calls class 9. Now again, I said you normally just have to skim ebook. Now I'm making reference to pages, I apologize. But page 3-9, I'd like some help from you. These are legal or blood relations. Tell me who's missing when we get done. And help me understand this a little bit. Those eligible for the dependency exemption include a child or a descendant of a child. Who's the descendant of a child? Grandchild. I understand that's good. A brother, sister, stepbrother, or stepsister. I understand that. The father or mother, or an ancestor of either. Who's an ancestor of father or mother? The grandparents, right, the grandparents. Stepfather or stepmother. Who's this? A son or daughter of a brother or sister. That's niece or nephew. Okay, good. A brother or sister of the father or mother. That's aunts and uncles. Then it says here, a son-in-law, daughter-in-law, father-in-law, mother-in-law, brother-in-law, or sister-in-law. What's a relationship that some people are real close to that's not in there? Becker always stresses that in their review class.
Cousin?
Cousins! I remember when I was single the first time, I used to date a number of people from the south part of Chicago, and they had these cousins clubs. You know, they're real close to their cousins. Cousin is too distant a relationship. So I would be like a cousin to you because we're not related. So that's what I call class 9. People who are either too distant a relation, like a cousin, or myself. Now, I could still be your dependent, but all the tests would have to be met. And one of the things that could happen on the first exam is, basically here, it says a non-related person must be a member of the taxpayer's household for the entire year. So write down in your notes, a cousin or unrelated person Let's stop at that one. If a single person provided more than half of the support, they would be the ones who would get the dependency exemption. Second, the group combined must have provided more than half of the support. The group combined must have provided more than half of the support. Third one I'm going to start, and I'll let you finish it if you can. In advance of our classes, if you can just skim through the material, then when our class is over, go through it in more depth, obviously, based on what we discussed in class. The person selected, this is the third point, the person selected for the exemption, must have provided more than, the person selected for the exemption must have provided more than, what's the percentage of the support? Anyone know?
10%.
10% is correct. They must have provided more than 10% of the support. So I put an example on the board which is similar to a question on the exam one. We got 3 brothers who are taking care of their dad, plus dad's best friend. Joe contributes 45% of the support, Tom 40%, Bill's cheap, 9%, and the best friend of the dad, 6%. That's the 100%. Who would be entitled to claim the dependency exemption?
Go on.
No.
Joe.
Joe or Tom. All 3 requirements are met. No one provided more than half. The group together provided more than half. And Bill and the best friend don't qualify because they didn't contribute enough. So it would be either Joe or Tom. And Joe or Tom would have to agree amongst themselves. There's also a form that has to be filed. I think it's in the 8000 series. Would have to decide who's going to get the exemption. Okay. Now, the gross, what is the gross income test? If Bill keeps putting up your gross income test or gross income test applied, what is the gross income test? Well, it says if someone is going to be your dependent, they must have less gross income than the personal exemption amount. They must have less gross income than the personal exemption amount. And we said the personal exemption amount is $39.50. So a person would have less than $39.50 of gross income. But what's in red? What do I have there in red? Does not include non-taxable Social Security. That's an exception, and I think that's beneficial because the minimum Social Security is probably greater than the personal exemption amount. So if on the exam in week 4, we have somebody who has a dad's a widower, he has $6,000 a year of Social Security, no other income. And we are providing most of his support. Could we claim Dad? Yes. First of all, Dad is a U.S. citizen. Father is a legal or blood relation. We're providing more than half his support. He has more gross income than the personal exemption amount, but non-taxable Social Security is an exception. So he meets the gross income test. And he's a widower, so he's not filing any other returns. So remember to claim somebody who's on Social Security that's going to be non-taxable. We had a situation on Tuesday night. Some student has a mom who's got $10,000 of Social Security and has no other income, and they're providing the support for the mom. And they would qualify. They would qualify because that $10,000 would be below the exemption amount we'll talk about next week, and that Social Security would not be taxable. Also, this is where the book is wrong. I have little asterisks there. And who's grading the exams? Bill. No, I mean, I love the text, and my friend Patrick Cummings and I had a half-hour talk the other day. We're both trying to write out he's a few years younger than me, but he's old too. I'm divorced, he is widowed. But this changed in the 2005 Working Families Tax Relief Act under George W. And the book, I believe, still has the old law. It used to be through the end of 2005, that you could claim someone as a dependent if they filed a joint return with their spouse, if the only purpose was to obtain a refund of all federal income taxes that had been withheld. That rule changed in the 2005 Act. So even if all these other tests are met, and that person files a joint return with their own spouse, for whatever purpose, you cannot claim them as a dependent. Now, there's a way to get around that. They could do married filing separate and get the refund of the taxes paid. And then it won't violate the rule because it's not a joint return. Now, let's talk about some